Loren, since this was your idea, where do you want to begin with it?
Um, well, I guess I'll begin by saying that this is a long time coming from me, is to have an opportunity to actually talk to Mark face to face. We've chatted through other means, whether it be Twitter or Facebook chat or whatever, but it's been a goal of mine to have an opportunity to meet him. So I'm going to take this as that goal achieved, even if it's meeting over the internet. But and I want to thank him for being willing to do this, because this has been a question that I've had for a while. Not so much a question, but definitely a discussion, and based around the article you wrote for your blog about volleyball interactions. And I think you actually ended up writing two. You wrote a follow-up to it as well. And you wrote it at like right about the time that I was starting to really explore the same ideas that you addressed in it, and it really helped me kind of solidify my thought process on it. But I guess, because then I'm assuming not everybody watching is going to be familiar, or not everybody necessarily probably clicked on the link to read the article. And I'd like to hear you explain it in as well again, Mark, and that's just your thoughts on volleyball interactions and why you feel that's the fundamentals of our game. Is that a big enough question?
Well, okay. So I think the article that Loren's referring to is the last one that I just put up links in the chat there. So there are a couple. One is the key to volleyball, the interactions in volleyball, and from reverse order. And the first one is a visual representation of interactions in volleyball. So in the simplest way that I can think to describe it is that volleyball is not, for me, a technical game. When I grew up, everybody said volleyball was really technical and really technically demanding, and you had to master all sorts of disparate skills and techniques and movements and so on. And over what's now a long period of time, more or less, for all intents and purposes, my life, watching volleyball and trying to understand it in different ways, how it really works and not how people perhaps think it works, I have come to the conclusion that the deciding factor in volleyball is not any of the technical things. Obviously, you have to be able to do some things at a certain level, but the deciding factor is the combinations of things, the interactions, and the interactions being various. So the interactions between the players on the court, it's the interactions between the phases of the game, the interactions between the coach and staff, the players and staff, and what else did I have here? Between the contacts in the net, between the contacts on one side of the net, and so on and so forth. Everywhere you look in a game of volleyball, there's a connection between people, between groups of people, and those are the things that decide about the game, the outcome of the game. More or less, all things being equal, and whatever level you're in, it's a more or less equal level, and the deciding factor is how all of the bits work together.
Real quick, the first link that Mark put up, the Shiny Apps one, if you click on the result tab on the upper left, it'll bring up the graphic. Yes. It's also in the blog post. All right, so you can see it in a little more interactive fashion.
Yeah, the graphic in the volleyball interactions, the very first one, is actually interactive. You can move around inside it.
Okay.
So,
and just for clarity's sake, these are all basically ball-related interactions. Yes.
I would have to check it, but yes, it's the interactions between no, because there are some opponent blocks. Yes, ball errors. So where the ball travels from one to the other.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we're not counting who's talking to who between plays, during plays, in timeouts. It's just strictly on the court in the game.
This is volleyball interactions between people.
Okay.
Gotcha.
All right, Loren.
Okay. So I guess my question for you would be, because I agree, first off, like 100%. That's where I've come to as well in my thinking about the game. And yet, as you said, you ask 99 out of 100 people who are coaches in the sport of volleyball, what are the fundamentals of volleyball? And you're going to get pass, set, serve, hit, block, dig. And
volleyball is serve and pass after all.
What's that?
Volleyball is serve and pass.
Yeah. And so if we have so many people who are, I don't know, like, maybe I'll rephrase it. And I'm going to, well, my question for you would be, where, like, how did you come to that realization? What allowed you to start thinking differently about it in that way, that it's not a technical game, it's a game of interactions that requires some technique, I guess is kind of what you've said.
The gameplay is the thing that always interested me in volleyball. So I grew up in Australia and we could replicate all of the skills more or less okay. Maybe we weren't as big as everybody else, but we could replicate all of the skills. But when you put us onto the court with people who knew how to play volleyball, there was a really obvious difference to me in the game. Like Australians could replicate some movements and actions and make the ball bounce more or less in the right direction, but they weren't able to play volleyball. So that's the first thing. Probably the part of it is the experiences as a player and going through a period in volleyball history where there was a very high technical requirement. So when I grew up playing volleyball, we were going through the Japanese Korean phase of learning how to do things, which was not playing volleyball and just repeating actions over and over again. And even as I was doing it, it seemed pointless and seemed to have no effect on the game. Then as a coach, spending a lot of time around really good players, the best in the world or close to the best in the world, and actually seeing the things that they did and the way they moved and the way they made decisions and the way they worked together. When good teams play, there's a way that they work together and move together and react with each other that is completely different from people who don't. So that's the maybe it's some combination of those things, and it's probably reasonable to include that I'm by nature a contrarian. So
okay.
My first response is to think everybody else is wrong.
Okay. Well, I like that too. No, that's awesome. I think from my standpoint, it's very similar thought process in there. Do you think, because you and we've discussed this in the past, how much background do you have working with youth in the sport of volleyball?
When I started to be a coach, I was a professional coach long before I was employed as a coach, because through the reality that I earned the bulk of my my salary, but I earned money by being a coach, by coaching whoever. So pretty much whoever called me up and said there's an hour's worth of coaching for $12, then I would get in my car and drive out and coach people for $12. So I coached everybody, more or less everybody that you can imagine, except girls. I didn't really ever coach, except for a couple of minor excursions. I didn't really coach any girls or women. So, but at that time, if people called me, then that's what I would have done. So I've coached everybody from 11-year-olds to Olympic champions.
And do you think that idea of emphasizing the interactions between the players and between the players and the ball and the players and the coach and the players and the opponent, do you think that emphasis applies just as much with 11-year-olds as it does with national Olympic level players?
You can't play volleyball without other people. It's impossible. So you can play football, you can play basketball. In football, you need to have, football meaning soccer, you need to have, do you even need to have a goalkeeper? You probably don't. So you can play with, you need two people because of kicking off. You need to have a second person to kick off. So you need two people. Basketball, you can play basketball with one person. So actually probably two, because the same thing, you need someone to throw the ball in when it goes out. So in volleyball, you can't play without other people. There's no other way of doing it. And this is, well, everything is interrelated, that a lot of the, I'm convinced as you can be, that a lot of the things people interpret as poor technical execution, the inability to move to the ball, for example, is not anything of the sort. It's a lack of understanding of how to work with people and move and make collective decisions. So it's as soon as two people are on the court, so playing beach volleyball, then it's about how those people work with each other, and every person you adds to that group adds an exponential number of connections and potential necessary interactions.
Yeah, what was the final number that you came up with? 5,200 and something? Remember?
I can. So I'll tell the story because for the people who don't know the story. So there's a band called Soundgarden, and guys wrote a story about what happened in the history of the band, and they started off as a three-piece band, three people, and at some point they wanted to add. They thought that they would become better if they added a fourth person, but they thought long and hard about it because they understood. One of them was a philosophy student. They understood that it wasn't adding one person, it was actually adding 7 relationships. So the relationships between 3 people are 3 times 1. I don't remember the number. It's 3 times 1, 2 times 2, and 1 times 3 or something like that. So it's 4 or 6 relationships or something. But to add one person added 7 relationships. So it made things very exponentially more complicated. Exponential is a word that's really in the common lexicon right now. So when he talked about that idea, I said, well, how many relationships are there in a 12-man volleyball team, not counting coaches, the staffs, and the number of relationships is 4,083. So each person has one relationship with 11 other people. He and or she has, in coupled with 11 other people, then has relationships with all the other possible combinations of 2 people and 3s and 4s, and until you go on. So when you change one person in a group, then you actually changed hundreds of relationships, not just one person. And that's the interpersonal stuff. That's nothing to do with that's the change room, the locker room, if you want. That's not anything to do with how the people interact on the court, or adding in the ball and stress and coaches and so on and so forth. 4,083.
4,000.
Every answer has a story.
Got it. So when you're coaching and putting an emphasis on the interactions of volleyball, and that's what, where you're the fundamental that you're coming from, then how do you teach that? How do you create better interactions? How do you I guess that's pretty much it. Just like, so, if I believed that the fundamentals were the skills of the game, you'd go out and isolate those. A lot of people go out and isolate those skills, teach the players how to do those skills really well, and then feel like they can put them back out on the court as separate pieces doing those skills, and those pieces will then interact and create success. Whereas my understanding of what you're saying, and also what I believe, is that they're not separate pieces that you can isolate out and then believe that they're going to come back together and create a cohesive interaction. And so if we emphasize the interaction between those not separate pieces, they're not actually separate. They are a system that works together. And if we can figure out a way to strengthen the connection, we're probably going to get them further than we would if we disconnected them. So I guess my question for you would be, how do you go about emphasizing that connection or interaction?
The first thing is understanding it, because if you don't have an understanding of what it is to play together, or how the things should fit together, you can't really you can't teach it or coach it. My suspicion, and this is just a suspicion, is that most coaches don't think about it, for one reason, because they don't think about it, one reason because people have told them that it's a technical game, and one reason that it's really difficult way to think about it. It's much easier, and this is not only about coaching. You can see this everywhere, that people want to separate things into their component parts, because those are the things that are easy to train and measure. It happens in training, separating different components of different energy systems. For example, you can only train one at a time, and then suddenly, miraculously, they all come together at the end when you need to compete. The ideas are all the same. It's simpler to work a tiny piece at a time, and it's easier to measure, and for the coach to see the value in their work. And that's what coaches want to be able to do. They want to see and measure and understand what it is that's making their team better. So they're looking at, this is I'll add that. I'll talk about that after. So the first thing is you have to have some kind of understanding, and then the second thing is that you have to practice playing volleyball. You have to do nearly everything that you were doing in the format of volleyball. And that means that that there is some isolations, block training, however you want to call it, but for the most part, you do combinations of drills, combinations of phases, and preferably all of them together. But then if you do that, what you have to do is you have to find ways to still practice different parts of that. So there are different sort of training ideas, training techniques for that. The other thing is that you have to focus the feedback that you give on the combinations and the interactions that you see. So so learning occurs in the presence of feedback. So if you give feedback on where my left foot is and whether it should be pointing to the net or the sideline or whatever, then that's the thing that people will focus on. But if they focus on when this happens, you need to be moving in this direction, you need to be looking in that direction, you need to be looking at that person, then that's the thing that they focus on. Well, that's the thing that they'll work on and learn, and that's the feedback that you have to give. And then you have to practice in that form. You have to allow chaos. You have to allow things that are ugly, because it's all part of the process of building those combinations, building those understandings between people and the movements, etc., etc.
Awesome.
You play volleyball and you give feedback on playing volleyball.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I guess I anticipated that answer, but it's good to hear you actually put it into words, because for me, that's how we do things here. And some of that for sure has been influenced by, well, to point to the title of the meeting, some of that's been influenced by the interactions that I've had with you and learning from you what you write, as well as other people who feel the same way, people like John Kessel. And so there's I think I've sent it to you before. I think we've talked a little bit about it, but there's a guy in the UK, Dave Snowden, who's a systems thinker and writer, talks about complex systems a lot. And he came up with this framework it's mostly business oriented, but I've started trying to apply it to youth sports, the Kinevin framework, that kind of shows, helps you understand what kind of system you're dealing with so that you can actually understand how best to try to make it work better. And
rings a bell. And
when he breaks it down into 4 parts, 4 basic system ideas where if you can recognize which one of these 4 areas you're in, you can have a better idea of how to actually interact with that system. And the 2 that I think apply here is, he has the simple system, which is, like a light switch, which I do understand that behind the wall there's things that are not as simple, but, a light switch, you turn it on, you flip it, it's just a simple interaction. There's no complex or complicated things going on. Mostly, and, a lot of machines are simple systems. But then we get into complicated systems, which have more parts. It's harder to necessarily understand what's going wrong, but if you delve into it, you can isolate where something is not working. And an example of that to me that I always use with our kids in our gym is the Rube Goldberg machines that you see on YouTube or wherever, where these vastly 10-minute long ball rolling down a ramp, hits a fan, the fan turns on and blows a balloon over here. This whole thing goes on and on and on until finally the last thing happens and everybody cheers. But if it doesn't work somewhere along the way, all you have to do is fix that one part where it didn't work. And the whole goal is to make sure that when you start it, you're going to get the same finish every single time. So the input will always equal the same output in a complicated system. Whereas he refers to most human interactions as complex systems, actually most natural interactions, I guess I would say, the weather, things like that, where you can't, where first off, the input doesn't equal the output every single time. And secondly, there is no linear way to just delve in and find what's wrong, because there's so many interactions going on. You can't isolate it to one thing. And I love what you said earlier about people have this need to compartmentalize, to break things down, that Cartesian mindset of everything can be broken down into like we treat a team of volleyball players and individual volleyball players as if they were a machine that we could break down into its parts and address the part that we think is broken. And then when we fix it, they go back out and they're going to be better. Whereas in a complex system, you can't isolate a part. You can't say, well, like you said, if somebody misses a pass, if they shank a pass into the stands and it knocks some lady's wig off or whatever, you can't figure out, you can't say that what was wrong there. You only thing you can say is that the outcome was wrong for what your intended goal is, but you can't, it's almost impossible in my belief to say exactly what was wrong there. Your right foot wasn't pointed in the right place. Next time, if you point your right foot in a better place, you're going to get a better pass. I think it's very much what you said. It's about the interactions involved there, both the interactions between teammates and then the interaction between the person passing the ball and the server, or the interaction between the person passing the ball, and where was their attention at, and what was their intent too. I mean, with our kids, we find out that probably 90% of the errors on the court happen because their intended goal wasn't clear enough or correct. And so then they don't do the right thing, the thing that we want them to do. And it's not going to help us at all to help them figure out where their elbow was or their hip was. What we need to do then instead is to clarify what their intent was. And once we do that, we start seeing much better play. And so I love how what you're saying interacts very much with systems theory and these ideas of using that human beings are complex adaptive systems, and that we, and the way you get a complex system to learn is to expose it to the problem and let it self-organize. So I love that about what you're saying there. And then one other final point I wanted to make about what you said about the interactions and coaching those interactions, about like you mentioned talking to them about when this happens, you should be moving here. When that happens, you should be looking there. To me, that's all very externally focused. It's not getting the athlete to be thinking about their body, thinking about their head, thinking about where's my foot, where's my arms. It's about the goal. Where are you going? What are you looking at? What are you trying to make happen? And I think that there's just so much research out there right now that points to the fact that external focus of attention is a much better way to achieve higher levels of play in any sport, as well as in physical therapy and things like that. So anyway, just my thoughts on
that. How do you know that 90% of the errors are errors of intent?
It was a total guess.
So you're making some basic assumption.
Yeah, I'm just saying when I ask a player after they've made an error why they think they made an error, they will always refer to their body. Their excuse is always going to be that something about their body is broken. My platform wasn't angled the right way. My arms weren't straight. My foot wasn't pointed in the right direction, whatever. But then when I ask them, well, where did you want to pass the ball to? Their answer is usually not what our system of play is actually asking them to do. And so then, or where were you trying to pass that ball? Especially with younger kids, the answer I get a lot is, I don't know. And then I'm like, perfect. The ball went right where you wanted it to. Then I don't know. If you don't know where you want the ball to go, then the fact that it went into the stands probably shouldn't surprise you. So I think it's more of a, 90%. I don't have any clue if that's a good number, but there's definitely there's definitely an interaction between the coach, me as a coach, and my players that has shown that the majority of times when a kid makes a mistake on the court, that mistake was made more because of their intention or their attention, not so much some technical fault, especially since, I mean, at the international level of play, you can turn on a match and watch 6 guys on each side of the court playing volleyball, and there's not a single guy on the court who's going to pass the ball the same way, hit the ball the same way, or set the ball the same way. So I think if we're trying to program kids to do things the same way, we're not really understanding what makes a high-level volleyball player.
There's a couple of reasons that I asked that question and picked on that topic, on that thing. One is that the goal is what leads the development of the technique. So whatever the technique is, it is hopefully the logical extension of achieving the goal. And if you have a really clear goal, if everybody understands what the goal is, then there are some basic things that have to happen, some basic body organization that has to happen for that outcome to be achieved. And it's crossed my mind, and I'm not working at that level, but it's crossed my mind more than once that the typical way of teaching is the opposite, that you teach the movement before you teach the goal. Right. And that seems obviously, well, not obviously, but it only came to me in the last 2 years, but that seems to me a backward way of looking at things. The goal should be the starting point, and then you work backwards from the goal, not forwards from the movement. The second one is that, and this is another thing that you've probably read from me a couple of times, is that we make, as coaches and as people, we make assumptions about the motivations of others. We make assumptions that their goals are, often aligned to ours. In the coaching environment, we can say we make the assumption that the goals of the players are aligned with ours, and not in the sense of winning the game or not winning the game, but in each rally. And it turns out that that's not actually the case. So the goal of an individual player may not be to win the rally, and the goal of a coach might not be to win the match. The goal of the it's funny how everything comes back to everything else. The goal of the coach can be to look like he's doing everything to win the match. So he takes all his timeouts and he makes all his subs and he screams at the referee and gets a yellow. And if he's really lucky, he gets a coach's hat trick. But his goal, he might think that his goal is to win the match, but really it's to look like he's doing everything to win the match. With players, it manifests itself in a bunch of different ways. My favorite is, a setter has a different, so at a reasonable level, setting the first tempo, setting the quick attacker is a much more effective way of scoring a point than setting any other ball. But no setter sets a majority of first tempo. And you might ask why that's the case, and I do often. Why doesn't DeCecco always set Simon? I mean, it's idiotic not to set Simon every ball. But if his object is to win the game, then probably he should. But one of the things, probably not in DeCecco's case, but one of the things is that if a first tempo doesn't score, everybody always thinks it's the setter's fault. Nobody, okay, we'll stick with 90%. It's the setter's fault if the first tempo doesn't score. But if you set it outside, even if it's a double block, then it's the spiker's fault when he doesn't score. So that's one of the things that about understanding how players think about the game and what their actual motivations are. So middle blockers. So middle blockers can actually go both ways. When they commit, they jump with the first tempo, then at least they're making a decision. And middle blockers often get caught up in the head-to-head battle with their opponent. They don't want to. They're not trying to win the game. They're trying to beat that guy. So they want to stop him. In other times, they don't want to. They'll only read. They won't commit because of the opposite reason. Then they're always at the ball and they're always nearly there. And then they can say, you know, it was always a double block, and so I did my job. So the errors of intent is a really interesting or misalignment of goals, or is a really interesting kind of concept to work through.
Yeah, well, I think that's spot on, because one thing we hear a lot here, at least in the United States in the sport, is coaches who will praise a player for touching a ball on defense.
I hate that.
You hear it all the time.
So much.
Nice touch. And then I think that then
actually sometimes I have to admit.
I think it reinforces with at least the kids I work with in my gym. What I've seen it do is it reinforces that their intent is just to touch the ball.
Yes.
And so
the logic behind it, as was explained to me when I was sort of playing on the edge of playing and coaching, was that if you tried to touch every ball, then eventually at some point you won't just touch it, you'll play it. And that has an attractive logic to it, except that if your goal is to touch it, then how is the ball going to go to the target ever if your goal is only to touch it?
Yeah.
And I had one of those moments with a player once who literally touched every single ball in defence but didn't keep one of them in play. And this was when I was a really young coach, and it was a national team player. And I said, "What are you trying to do?" He said, I'm trying to play defence," or whatever the answer was. And I said, "Well, now I want you to try and dig it to the setter." And that change of intent makes a big difference. He was a middle blocker, so he didn't get them all up, but the difference was fairly stark.
Yeah. I mean, we see that all the time. And I coach primarily teenage girls, so I know there are differences there as well. Some of them, on their self-efficacy and self-confidence and things along those lines. But we also have, we get kids who will, a ball will get hit and they get, 2 fingers on it, sprawling off to their left, and they'll get up and they'll be like, "Well, at least I touched it." And then my first question for them is, does that score points? Like, does that help your team win a game just to touch it? Or do you think maybe your goal next time should be to actually get it up so that one of your teammates can play it? And they're like, and I'm like, wouldn't that be something that would cause a more positive goal for the whole team? And, a lot of them they just don't get it because they've been praised so often for simply touching the ball. And, like I've asked, we have a girl in our gym who plays soccer, also football for you. And she's a goalie. And I've asked her many times when she plays defense and says, "Well, I touched it. At least I touched it." I'm like, would that work as a goalie? Like, the ball goes flying past you into the goal and you touched it. Are you going to go to your coach and be like, "Well, at least I touched it"? No, that other team still got a point. So I think, maybe part of it is because in our game there's 25 points to give away. And so if you just gave away 1, you can still be happy with the fact you touched the ball because maybe you believe you're going to come back on the next point. Whereas in soccer, there's so few points scored that touching a ball doesn't really matter. It's about keeping the ball out of the goal. So I don't know. I just think that something you said in there really made me just really think about that idea of what's your intent? If I'm a hitter, And I've had kids who are like, well, I hit it hard, okay, but it went 5 feet out of bounds. You know, what was that your intent? Was just to hit it hard, or was your intent to actually aim for the outside of the blocker's left hand, so that that ball would bounce off of them and then go out of bounds? What was your intent? And I think we need to, as coaches, we need to be better at praising the intent than the actual outcome. If your intent was to dig it to your teammate and yet you only touched it, I think you can praise them for the intent of digging it. But if they're happy, well, my intent was just to touch it, then I don't think we should be praising that, because that's not an intent that actually wins games.
In the specific defense situation, I would say that one of the things about practicing in combinations in 6-against-6 formats is that it provides feedback. So it provides that feedback exactly. So if you touch the ball in defense when you're playing with other people, it's not really very good. And if you get it to somebody to be able to attack, then the feedback is there that was a good dig. So yeah. I like to, my approach to that is by linking defense with attack. So a defense only counts if you can attack, or an attempt at defense only counts if there's an attack. So whatever, depending on where you are in the process, it only has value if you can spike. And that's actually what, if we want to go back to some statistics stuff, that's what I measure that's how I measure defense, is how many attacks I get.
Right. Yeah. We try to get our kids to understand that a lot by saying, how do you know if it was a good dig? And the answer usually will be, well, if my setter can set it. And we try to get them to understand that it's really a good dig if your hitter got a kill. And
that's the object.
Even if you feel like your dig was terrible, it didn't go where you wanted it to, but your setter still gets a great set and the hitter still gets a great swing, then your dig was fine. It was a good dig because you got a kill off of it. And seeing that, like, again, the interactions, how they are linked, everything we do on the court is linked to everything else, rather than trying to isolate it out and then put it back together. You had a great dig, you had a great set, you had a great swing, so we had a great play. I think we had a great play, and that's it. It can stop right there. So
I agree.
I think that was really all I wanted to talk about, because I just really wanted to hear you express, it's different hearing somebody talk about what they believe than to read what they've written on a blog post. And so I just thought it would be a great opportunity when John asked me if I wanted to talk to anybody in particular, give me a chance to chat with you, because that concept has influenced what we do in our gym. And I think I don't have stats, but I can say that it has influenced positively what we do in our gym.
Thank you. So I have a question for John now. So it's one thing to see something written down, and it's another thing to hear somebody say it. John has seen my practice. You've seen my practice?
Multiple times.
So do I do what I write and say?
There's one instance I could give you some grief over. You might remember it, might not. But for the most part, your team practices are almost entirely 6v6. The stuff that the players are doing before that looks like some variation of volleyball, bag or whatever. Aside from... you do a lot of second balls. No, you do a lot of second balls to where on your focus points, as you were talking about before, in terms of directing your feedback and what particularly you're paying attention to in that time frame in that session. So yeah, for the most part, I mean, the morning sessions, like when I was there for the national team, those were structured a little bit differently, but you also had other coaches involved in that, so I'm not going to put that too much on you.
So I may or may not be right, but at least I'm consistent.
Which is probably more right than someone who's 100% right but can't do it every time. So
that's one of my theories. One of my theories.
One of
that. Well, we discuss a lot about right and wrong, and in volleyball, so you have a whole what's the word? A whole business model that's built around the idea that there's one right way of doing things. There's another business model which is equally successful, more or less, that is that there's no right way of doing things, that all ways are equally valid. And if you look around, there are a lot of different ways of playing volleyball and practicing volleyball and achieving certain outcomes. Brazilians do things completely differently from Americans, completely differently from Russians, etc., etc. And the basic theory goes is that it really doesn't matter what exactly you do, as long as you have a concept and you consistently apply it. And then if you have enough time and good enough players, then you can have some kind of success. But of course, it's difficult. That's a difficult idea to sell.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think what most people are trying to avoid admitting is that a huge part of your success is the player that you have. And, you know,
nobody wants to admit that.
The coaching is not as big of a part of it as that is. There was a graphic that Steve Bain gave or showed me about a year ago that was a big round circle. Try to find the camera. Big circle. That big circle was all the things that influence a player positively, like that helps a player learn, all the things that influence learning for a player. And then over on the kind of overlapping on the side, a smaller circle was all the things that a coach does, and it overlaps the big one. I wish I could just draw it, but whatever. In that circle is all the things a coach does intentionally to influence player learning. And of course, there's a big chunk of that circle that's outside of the stuff that actually influences a player. And then there's a little tiny one in the middle that is all the things that a coach – sorry, the bigger one is the things a coach does, and then the little circle is the things that a coach does on purpose. So there's all these things that a coach does that they don't really even do on purpose that probably influences the player's development and the team's development without the coach even thinking about it or even doing it intentionally. And then there's all the little tiny section where the coach actually has intentional influence over the team.
I missed some part of that because, as John would attest, at about the 45-minute mark, my internet connection always seems to drop out.
Basically describing a Venn diagram.
Yeah, somewhat of a Venn diagram, yeah.
Yeah, with the big circle being... Big circle of the Venn diagram is all the things the coaches do. And then the little circle, partly overlapping the big circle, is all the things the coaches do intentionally.
Right.
To influence player performance, behavior, development, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that concept because it helps you understand that there's a whole lot of interactions going on in the gym that aren't conscious, and that if we can
Right.
a little bit more conscious of them, then maybe we're going to influence things more. You know, whether it be even so much as like the coach's body language, how they're standing while they're watching practice or watching a match, what tone of voice a coach decides to give feedback in. All those things, which tend to be unconscious from a coach's point of view, end up having a pretty large influence on the learning process.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. There's like one thing I've written about before is that players remember everything. Everything you say, every throwaway line, every joke that you make that you didn't mean, they remember it. And well, I mean, they could use it against you, but it'll come up at some point. But 4 years ago on Tuesday, when you told me that I should put my left foot there, and now you're telling me I should put my right foot there. So that's why I always ask the question about consistency, because you have to be. But the number of like throwaway lines just in a social interaction that have come back to me 5 years later, you know, is always food for thought. And I've talked about it, you know, I've talked about it often enough that coaching is a big part of coaching is a show. You know, it's all parts of it. It's all an act. So sometimes, well, no, it's not all an act. But you have to be conscious of what you're doing, and sometimes you're angry when you not. Sometimes you have to pretend to be angry when you're not. Sometimes you have to. More often, you have to pretend not to be angry when you are. You know, it's all a show. Coaches are actors.
Mark, there was a question somebody asked, and I addressed to you, and I thought it'd be cool to have you answer it. If you're training younger age, say 9 and under, and they are not athletic, would you teach them to move before you teach them the skill?
I'm a little reluctant to answer that question because I don't actually coach 9-year-olds, and I have a 6-year-old. What my stock answer to that would be that I wouldn't teach anything before anything else, that I would still be trying to teach combinations of things. So so people working together, moving and playing. I don't know the different, I mean, the obvious one is that I'm sure most people use for 9-year-olds is to play a version of volleyball that's throwing and not rebounding, sort of things like that. So, you know, I don't like the idea beyond whatever the Kessel line is about. Once you have the basic movement pattern down, you go and play in some way. And the art of coaching, I guess, is to find the way of playing that's appropriate to the level. So at what point, where you put the ball in, where you control it, that's the best answer I can give.
Yeah, I agree, because
even though I'm never going to have to put my money where my mouth is, hopefully.
Well, I do. I mean, I work with kids from the age of 7 on up, and with our youngest level, we just play games. I follow the idea of that we are going to simplify the game rather than isolate the parts. So we play 2-on-2 with lower net, lighter ball, and a catch on one of the 3 contacts, or on all 3 of the contacts, depending on the level of the, how good are they? Are they able to do it? And if they are, then we ramp it up a little bit, and we found that within that context, we can teach them to move the way with a goal, which is, in my opinion, a better way to learn to move. We always move with a goal in a sport. And if you just teach them to move, it's not actually the same movement. moving to pass a volleyball that is being served to you, in my opinion, is not the same skill as moving in a shuffle with your platform out when there is no ball. And so I think we have to give those youngest kids the goal. Give them a ball. Give them a net. Give them the opportunity to want to score a point. And within that, teach them, give them the opportunity to learn how to move in the way that's most likely going to result in a positive outcome for them and their teammates.
Yes.
Okay, we got another question that came in. When you're getting a lot of errors, either by the team or individual players, how do you, the term is interact with that, but how do you address it? What do you believe is the best way to help your team or the individual involved?
It's a pretty open question. The first thing is what's the cause of the error? If the cause of the error is, I don't know, if the cause of the error is really some fault in the performance of the technique, then you would want to make it, try to simplify in some way with inside the game format, which you can do in various ways. Now, I made this note to bring up at some point, but always working in 6 against 6 is it's not. It's a really good way, but there are some weaknesses in it, and there are sometimes you have to step out of that. So maybe if there are a lot of errors, you do have to step out of that for some shorter period of time. If it's an error of attention, and a lot of the errors that happen in practice are errors of attention, players are not focused on practice, then you need to intervene to address that. Maybe you have to raise your voice. Maybe you have to change the scoring system to increase the attention. If it's the way players are working together, then feedback and repeat the situation so that the players work better in that situation. There's no one way to help the team. You have to have an understanding of what the cause of the error is. If it's people are or players are trying to do the wrong thing, so that Loren was talking about before, to understand, for them to understand what the correct goal is. All of those things, I think, are ways that could help, but there's no one answer to every question, and you have to look at each one differently.
Love it. I would add to that just one thing, and that is that what might work today probably won't work tomorrow. In that
could be too. That's the really annoying thing.
Yeah, I mean, you step in and intervene today, and it worked. You get the errors disappear. Tomorrow, the errors are there again. You step in with the same intervention, and it doesn't work. And I think that's where that complex system of human beings differentiates itself from a machine. Who knows what the difference is? I'm not sure we can find it, but that's the art of coaching, is finding what works today for the athlete in front of you, not what worked last week for the athletes that were in front of you then. There's another question. Mark, do you think that show of the coach influence more results of your guys on the court than the preparation, or is it equal? The same question about your experience by women and men, impact of the coach interaction as actor on the side of the court. More influenced by the men or by the women? Well, that's a big question.
Yeah, this is another question where you're not going to like the answer. So, but then the answer, it comes back to it's a combination. It's a combination of things, because the show, the acting is in the preparation as well. So there are lots of things that you do during the game as well. Vital Heinen is in some ways is the king of this. How he interacts with the game as the coach, and the show that he makes for his team, for the other team, and so on. So I don't at the higher level, and I mean, even when I was playing sort of local volleyball, there's always some element of a show in the game, whether it's no touch, or all of those different kinds of things. So I can't measure the impact of the coach as actor, but I'm certain that it's part of it, and in some cases a big part of it. I know matches that I've coached that I've been able to influence by acting, by doing one thing or the other, and so where I've been able to really affect the mood of the whole team. So it's not something that gets talked about in coaches' books. Maybe that's a chapter of mine now, but it's definitely there. And I can't talk about the difference between men and women. I haven't coached a women's team in any sort of extended way.
I'd argue that there effectively isn't any difference. There might be nuances into the technique of what you say or the tone of what you say, but conceptually it's the same, I think, for both genders. You're still trying to act in a way that gets the best performance out of them, the best result out of them consistently.
Yeah. I would say that there's probably more of a difference between ages than there is genders. If what you do as a coach when you're coaching a 14 and under team, I think is going to have a different effect than what you do as a coach if you're coaching a collegiate team. Because as a parent, you're treating those ages differently. As any teacher, you're treating those ages differently. So I think as coaches, it's the same thing. But gender-wise, in my experience, there's not any difference.
I bow to your superior knowledge.
You're not bowing very far.
Mark Ruth? Yeah. Mark Ruth wants to know who's responsible for you staying in the game as long as you have?
The flippant answer is me, because I've been so stubborn that I didn't ever want to change what I did. The real answer is actually probably still the same. I just, at some point, I just really like volleyball. That's the basis of it. It's called at home on the court for a reason.
I'm doing this webinar during a stay-at-home order from my gym, so that tells you where I feel most comfortable.
Yeah.
All right, folks. That's all the questions we have, unless anybody wants to kick one in late.
I'm going to shoot one at Liam, who I see there. See if he's paying attention. If I'll ask him the same. He spent a bit more time with me than John has, so maybe Liam has a two-word answer on how consistent I am between written, speaking, and actions.
Liam, open up. There you go. Your mic is open.
Yeah, extremely. It's something that we focus on, or at least there's some consistent feedback for us as assistants about making sure that the message is the same. When we deliver scouting, the ideas of what we're talking about, we practice how we talk to the players. Yeah, that consistency and the language especially is, that's something we talk about a lot.
All right. Bonus points for sketch.
All right. Can not come back then.
Thank you.
Okay. Loren, can you see the question from Frederick?
Yeah. Talking about the difference between the influence we have on younger teams versus a higher level top teams. I think it's energy to a degree. I think it's, for us, we like to think of it more as like, well, to steal Mark's phrase or whatever, I think it's consistency, but I also think it's psychological safety for those younger kids, where they feel whatever response we're going to give, whether you're a cheerleader type coach who is jumping up and down and screaming in positive ways for your team, or you're sitting calmly and watching and then giving a thumbs up. I think you can do, first it has to be authentic to who you are as a human being. I think if you do...
That's really, really important. That's really, really important.
Biggest move for me was understanding that if you try to do things that other people are doing with success and it's not who you are, your kids are they're gonna sense the BS, and they're not gonna trust you, and you're not gonna do it very well because it's not who you are. Whereas if you can just figure out how who you are as a human being can be at best help the players in front of you and be you and do it for them, then I think I guess it's three parts: consistency, authenticity, and then creating that psychological safety, especially for the younger players, where they're so afraid of making mistakes and so afraid of what's going to happen if they let their team down or their coach down. And if you can just give them that sense of safety, that they're just there to learn and that you're going to love them at the end of the match the same as you did at the beginning of the match, that energy then creates itself. I think where kids lose energy is when they're not in a psychologically safe environment where they feel like they're being judged or incriminated or punished for the things that happen on the court. And maybe that holds true at a higher level too. I don't know.
I wrote a post, I think it's over a year ago now, talking about introversion and extroversion for coaches, that was based on a quote from the book Barking Up the Wrong Tree by Eric Barker. And the quote I've got here is, whether an introvert or an extrovert is a better leader depends on whom they're leading. He's using employees in this case. So when employees are passive, the social, energetic extroverts really shine. However, when you're dealing with very motivated workers, introverts do better because they know how to listen, help, and get out of the way. My interpretation of that was along the lines of, as you're working with players with a higher level of mastery and the higher level of self-motivation, the coach doesn't need to be the energetic leader. That would be the case for, as you were kind of saying, Loren, the younger ones who are less confident in their abilities or much earlier in the curve, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and less confident in themselves as human beings. So.
Yep. Got one other question here. No, that was done. And Mark, you answered that other question, right? So, yeah. Okay, unless you guys have anything else, closing comments or anything, we'll wrap it up.
Other than just to say thanks to both of you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys and to do something other than stare at walls and pace back and forth. So,
well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Loren, for the invitation, and thanks, John, for facilitating it.